Welcome to QSTP. We have an exciting, personally, I'm very excited about this Technovate. I had a bit of a teaser about it yesterday, so I'm really looking forward for it. Today we have an amazing topic, building, managing, and leading innovation teams. On that platform, we have discussed so many things related to innovation, setting up startups, like what's a good idea, how can we, whether the Middle East has the right elements or not. There were so many people sitting here, but today we need to pay a special focus to the most important thing, most important factor in any organization, which is human capital, because it doesn't matter how much technology continues to drive our business, still human beings are the most important and valuable asset a company, especially startups, can have. I'm not going to talk about the guests. We'll leave that to Dr. Maher Hakim, who will moderate this session. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Dr. Maher Hakim, Managing Director, QSTP.
Thank you all for coming again. This is our fourth Technovate, probably the last of the season, although my team is telling me we should do another one. Where's Ghada? Should we do another one, Ghada? We'll probably do one more before the summer, but I think today actually we hit the jackpot. We have three amazing guests that are gonna discuss the topic with us, and I'm gonna introduce them. I'm gonna introduce the first two guests to a discussion, and then we'll introduce the third guest later to give us a little bit of a talk, a pep talk. So it's my honor to introduce our first guest, who is Terry Jones. Terry is a very well-known author and public speaker on the topic of innovation and entrepreneurship. Oh yeah, it works, great. You did it, wonderful. Terry has a very interesting career. So after about 24 years working at American Airlines in various roles in IT and marketing, he decided to do an innovation startup company within American Airlines. So he was among the original team that founded Travelocity.com. Travelocity.com was founded as an entity within American Airlines, and later on is spun out as an independent company and went public, I believe. And Terry led it as a CEO to the point of about $3 billion in revenue. After that, Terry started Kayak.com, which, how many of you used Kayak.com? Hi, very impressive. Kayak.com is another innovation in the travel industry and was later sold to Priceline, I believe, for about $1.8 billion in 2013. And Terry now is on his third startup, again a technology company in the travel world, and this time using AI to make decision-making easier for travelers to discover journeys online. He's also, by the way, in his spare time, a mentor for a number of startup companies and also a venture capitalist. So I'm happy to welcome Terry on stage. My second guest is Chris Ye, who is also an author and speaker on topics ranging from innovation to talent management. He's a co-author of a couple books, and I think a third book is coming very soon about scaling startup companies. Chris has been involved in building internet businesses since the mid-90s, although he doesn't look it at all, actually. Chris is a general partner at Wasabi Venture Global, which is a venture capital, startup incubator, and consultancy company. Welcome, Chris. Good to have you. So we thought the topic that we're going to discuss this evening is about how you manage people in a knowledge-based economy era. And it's not just really about a knowledge-based economy, it's innovation-based economy. So as you know that today the buzzword is all about innovation, which is a very specialized area in a knowledge-based economy. But as Omnia had mentioned, that we all know that the most important element to build a knowledge-based economy is the people. And knowing how to organize, how to recruit, lead, and manage people in the knowledge-based economy is a very crucial element. Chris gave a talk about that yesterday briefly, and one of the things, Chris, that hit me in your talk is when you said that there was statistics that talk about people being engaged at their work, right? And then the numbers you had showed that, I don't know, 19% of all Americans, 19% of all Americans are actually engaged in their work. And Chris went on to talk about different elements about that. But what I wanted to start with is a question for you gentlemen. Why is it important for people to be engaged in their work in a knowledge-based economy? Why not just give them tasks and let them run with it and do whatever they want to do, even if they're not engaged? What's so special about being engaged?
So when we talk about engagement, we're talking about people who feel a deep emotional connection to their work. They feel like when they go into the office or wherever they happen to work, maybe it's a coffee shop, that they're going to do their best, but more importantly, that what they're doing is actually an expression of themselves. So when we think about a knowledge-based economy, we're really focused on things like innovation and trying new things, right? It's not an industrial economy where people are just repeating the same process over and over again. They're actually being paid for their ability to learn and discover new things. And if you're not actually engaged, if your brain isn't intellectually captured by the challenge, you're just not going to do very good work. And I think we can see that when we look out in the corporate landscape and we look at companies where engagement levels are lower, they're clearly less innovative. They're oftentimes just relying on innovations that have come in the past, and maybe they're just turning the crank now. And if you look at companies that are innovating and doing new things, especially if you look at companies in Silicon Valley, for example, you see a very high level of employee engagement, and it's because people are doing something that they want to do. It's not about the job, it's about the mission or the calling.
So there's a wonderful quote from Herman Melville. He says, "We are the advanced guard, moving through the wilderness of untried things." He wrote that 100 years ago, but I think it absolutely resonates when we talk about startups. And you mentioned Travelocity. So when we started Travelocity inside American Airlines, I said to the airline, look, I want to bring in some people from the outside, people who aren't with the American Airlines culture, maybe who are more engaged. And it took me 6 months to fight with HR to let me go outside and bring those people in. And I finally was able to do that. So on the one side, I had young people who were very engaged, moving fast. They really didn't know travel. On the other hand, I had the .corps, right? And you can spell that either way, corpse or corpse. And the suits, and they knew the industry, but they weren't as engaged. And putting them together was wonderful. It was like having cats in a bag. They fought like crazy. But that was the crucible that helped us move forward, because we did need the people who understood the industry, but we needed the super engaged people. The other thing I would say is that there were a lot of people at American Airlines that wouldn't come to our little startup because it wasn't on their ladder. It wasn't on their course to the top. When we were about to go public, a lot of them wanted to come. We said, sorry, no tickets, you can't come now. So it was very important to get a group of people that were highly engaged early on. And the same thing was true at Kayak, and we could talk more about it.
And tell us more about, I think when you and I had a conversation this morning, Terry, you talked about getting the right people and getting them engaged, but you also talked about your ability to disconnect the processes of the old organization and create your own processes to make that happen, and the support you got from
the company. Yeah, it's an interesting story. It's in my book because I talked to a lot of companies about internal innovation, and what we had to do at Travelocity, I moved out of the building. I found an abandoned piece of space that the airline owned a few miles away. It took me a year to get IT to move in with us because IT was afraid to actually be with their customers. But when we got everyone together, now we started building our own culture. I disconnected from the systems because their systems weren't fast enough. I disconnected from purchasing. They only knew about B2B. I was B2C, so I disconnected from advertising. Each one of those was a battle because everyone wanted to help, but they all had rules. And I had to have a boss who was the chairman of the airline who was protective. So he was providing air cover for this little idea. It was also important that he held the budget very high up, because I was in the marketing department and they would have stolen all my money for an ad on the Super Bowl or something. So you have to put new ideas in a greenhouse and let them grow up enough so that they can live on. And that actually worked at Travelocity. There's a wonderful story about REI, recreational equipment. It's a big sports seller in the United States. They too started a separate division for the internet when the internet came around, and they said, but when the internet grew up, we turned the organization chart on its side and poured the internet in and dissolved the division and made everyone responsible for e-commerce. So it's the growth period that is the hard period where you have to protect something. When it grows up, you have choices. But starting something inside a company is very different than a startup in Silicon Valley, a whole different set of problems.
Chris, what makes people feel engaged? What makes employees feel engaged?
Well, it's interesting. So they've done studies and surveys on engagement, and they can identify which employees are engaged, self-reported of course, and which employees are not engaged. And the things that distinguish engaged employees from non-engaged employees are not necessarily the things you would necessarily think. So, for example, even disengaged employees feel like they understand what's expected of them, that their managers are telling them very clearly, this is what you're supposed to be doing. Disengaged employees feel like they have the tools they need to actually do their job. And in one study I looked at, 53% of disengaged employees felt like they actually had the opportunity to be their best at work every day. Now, those are not things that you typically think of as associated with disengagement. And they're not, but they're just not associated with engagement. In fact, the things that make people feel engaged at work are a sense that somebody cares about them, a sense that they're making progress in their career and their skills, and a sense that they have opportunities in front of them. And that's one of the reasons why it is typically easier for smaller companies to deliver higher levels of engagement, especially in a startup like Travelocity or Kayak. The company is growing so quickly that the employees feel like there's an endless series of opportunities in front of them, whereas in a more mature company, it can become more difficult unless the company has done a great job of creating career paths.
You want to add anything to that, Terry?
Well, I'd say it was interesting to watch at Travelocity. We brought some people over from the airline who knew everything about airline fares. And they were mainframe programmers. And we retrained them to work at our pace and our speed. And after about 6 months, they went back because they liked the slow pace. They liked to deliver things in a year instead of a month. And they got very disappointed when, they'd work on a project for 6 months and we cancel it because the market had changed. Where we had a whole other group that thrived on that change. And that's what you need. That are people to open to change, that can turn on a dime, the market will change, the business will pivot. And if they just want a straight line, you don't want them because there is no straight line in a startup. It doesn't happen.
Terry, I'm going to put you on the spot here because I know we talked about that. So when we talked about the United Airline incident this morning, what struck me is that you were on the fence, right? So you sort of defended them, but did not defend. You said, well, it's a command and control culture, and it's an airline, so it must live as a command and control culture because they have policies and procedures that they need to follow. And you're not sure if they followed the procedures. The question for you is, what could the airline have done? Even if these guys followed the procedure literally, they ended up obviously doing something wrong that didn't benefit the airline, right?
The problem was, first of all, if you know the plane is oversold, you don't put everybody on. Yeah. So you don't create, they created their own problem. They did not give them the flexibility to pay enough money to get people off the airplane. So if they had offered $2,000, $3,000, people would have gotten off. You didn't have to have an incident. And it's absolutely ridiculous to ever do something like that to another human being or certainly to a customer. So airlines have to have rules so they operate, and because it's a big, complex machine, but you have to give people a certain amount of flexibility. And United hadn't done that, and the people weren't correctly trained, and they didn't follow the rules that they had. They were making it up as they went along. and it got totally out of hand. And the other thing is today, as a CEO, and I've been CEO of public companies, you live in a world where everyone sees everything. So you cannot stand up and say this didn't happen, or my people were, you have to apologize immediately. Yeah. That's the only thing you can do. And say, you know, we're going to try to do better. Because everything is visible. You live in a glass house. You can't act like companies acted 20, 30 years ago. It's impossible. And you shouldn't.
There is it's obvious that the employees at the front line were scared of doing something that seemed obvious that it was the right thing to do because they thought it didn't follow the rules, right? So and that leads me to the next question, which is, it's an interesting study, research that Google had done. For Google, the most important thing is that they hire the best people and they create the best environment for the best teams to work and collaborate with each other. So they spend a lot of time and money studying how teamwork works, you know, how people collaborate. And they looked at very different factors of what are the things that make the best teams perform better. And what they identified at the end of the day, that it's not about necessarily intelligence or skills or gender or age, or none of these factors really mattered. What mattered is a factor they call psychological safety. And the psychological safety basically describes how safe an employee feels about expressing his or her opinion within a context of a group. And that safety comes not necessarily from a boss or anything, sometimes from the culture, from the peer pressure, but maybe you can talk to us about that, Chris, a little bit.
Certainly, and the amazing thing about Google is they've invested so heavily in data and analytics, they can tell you all sorts of things. If you've ever read some of the books about Google, you'll know that they actually studied how many job interviews they could actually give a candidate before it actually began to detract from the decision-making process. So they had candidates who were coming in and interviewing with 8, 10, 12 different people, and they realized, no, if we have them interview with more than 5, we won't actually get any better at making the decision, but we will piss them off. So what Google's data shows is that psychological safety is in fact highly correlated with the performance of the teams. And it actually makes a lot of sense, because if you think about what causes people to feel safe, it's because they trust the other people they're working with. And a lot of times we hear the word trust, we don't really think about what goes into it. We think, oh, they're honest, oh, they're capable. Well, trust is really about your willingness to be vulnerable with other people, to not use all the defenses and hold back and do all those various things that we could do to protect ourselves. We often talk about how there are 2 different primary drives, approach and avoidance. Avoidance being the drive that allowed our caveman ancestors to hear a rustling in the bushes and say, wow, that's a tiger, I'm going to avoid that. Or to see a bush full of beautiful berries and say, I'm going to approach that and I'm going to try that. And so when people feel safe, they shift into the approach mode. They open themselves up to new experiences and new ideas. And when they trust that the people around them are not going to attack them, if they put forth an idea and that idea might be wrong or that idea might be controversial, then they're more likely to actually bring these things out. Every innovation occurs because someone was willing to try something new. Does anyone here feel like they want to try something new in a risky environment? Probably not. You want to be in an environment where you feel like it's okay if this doesn't necessarily work, because if it advances our cause, if it advances our company, if it makes things better, then it's worth trying.
I talk about something a lot in my lectures about what I call the Boson Layer. And the Boson Layer is the impenetrable layer of middle management that stops good ideas from moving upward. And it's not really the fault of the middle manager, it's they're not rewarded for change. So it's really important, in order to make that safety, that the leader reaches down and says, this is Bob's idea, we're going to try it. And this is Sally's idea, it failed, and we're giving Sally another chance. And as soon as people see that the leader is accepting of failure, then the Boson Layer goes away. But so many people are afraid of innovation because they think, hey, if I fail, I get fired. And if I have a new idea, maybe they'll give me a $100 bonus. There's no reward, and there's only punishment. And if that occurs, then people don't feel safe. One of the things I did a lot at Travelocity was, people would find me 2 or 3 levels down in the company, even when we had several thousand people, talking to a programmer and sitting in their office. And sometimes the managers in between would get very worried. Well, he might say something I don't know. He might talk about something. And I said, well, if you don't know it, it's only because you're not hanging out with them. So don't get worried. Hang out. Do what I do. And it created a culture where, anybody could meet with anybody at any time and discuss anything. So you have to break down all those barriers. And then people feel safe to walk in. And then maybe they say something stupid, but that's okay. You just move on. There are lots of ideas, and they aren't all good. But if you don't hear them, you can never move forward.
So the three of us come from a generation where we've been long in the workforce, right? So 20-some years, maybe.
Twice.
Do you think the younger generation, the millennia and the younger people, have a different criteria for being engaged? Is that something, because we hear a lot about expectations and unmet expectations, and people who are entering the workforce now, or they've entered in the past 5-10 years, there's a different behavior at work. And do you see that, and what is the level of engagement? What kind of mechanisms that need to be in place to allow that level of engagement from them?
Well, before we begin, I always like to sort of sample the audience. How many people in the audience are actually of the millennial generation? The definition we're going to use is that you were born between the years 1982 and 2000. So just raise your hands if you were born as a part of the millennial generation.
Good
Okay,
percentage.
it's a good percentage of the audience. I got to be careful what I say. So when it comes to millennials, what I often like to tell people is, there's a lot of news stories out there about millennials saying things about millennials. They're self-centered and they're entitled and all these different things. And I find that if I'm at a conference and I'm talking with a lot of 40 and 50-something managers, and I bring this up, they say, oh yeah, absolutely, And I'm like, okay, so what is it that millennials do that's so entitled? Well, they ask for what they want. Oh wow, that seems like a terrible idea. In fact, I would argue that in many cases, there really isn't much difference between millennials and older generations. The difference is they're actually willing to voice the things that people used to feel. However, there are changes that you need to put in place. So, for example, if you think about millennials, one of the things that millennials really crave is feedback. Now, we all crave feedback, but us old guys learn to do without it and just soldier on. But millennials are used to a system in which they are receiving feedback on a constant basis. So if you are a manager and you're working with millennials, one of the things you need to do is to get used to checking in on a far more frequent basis than you might with employees from an earlier generation. The other thing to remember about millennials is when they came of age. So I was reading an article recently saying that millennials could be divided into old millennials and new millennials. This is the world we've come into now. We have to divide up generations further. But I thought the article made a good point, which is that there actually is a sort of turning point. And they look at the year 2007, 2008 as both the emergence of the iPhone and the global economic crisis of 2008. And that really does produce this demarcation line where a younger generation is a truly digitally native generation, but also grew up in an era of great economic uncertainty. And so as a result, especially younger millennials are highly active on social media, but are also very much feeling insecure about the economic situation and don't believe that a company is going to allow them to work there for 24 years. And so you need to, as a manager of those millennials, understand the kind of social media activity they might be participating in, and also understand that, their concept of what a career looks like is probably going to be very different than what the concept of you, a 40 or 50-something manager, thinks of.
There's a phrase that you have to teach old dogs new tricks. And of course, millennials are teaching us old dogs new tricks all the time. But we also have to teach new dogs old tricks. And we don't hear that phrase as much, but it's important. I know that the CEO of my new startup, he's probably he's certainly above the millennial age, so he gets frustrated by some of the millennials he works with, same issues. And having to give the feedback. But the reverse is also true. They're digital natives. And, you know, I'm 68, so I'll call somebody and say, hey, I opened that lead, and, you know, did you follow up with that guy? He said, well, I sent him 3 emails, and he didn't answer. And I said, well, did you ever call him? Did you ever try to go see him? Well, no, he didn't answer an email. And, you know, they're trying to deal with somebody who's not a digital native, and they can't believe he didn't answer an email. So it works both ways, and we're of different generations. And you have to realize that the natives have to deal with people who, you know, aren't digital natives as well. So I think that's occurred in every generation since the beginning of time, that we have to understand those not digital divides, the divides between generations, and accommodate for them and understand them, because they're going to exist in any organization. And then how do we work together to be the most effective team across those generational lines?
As a side note, I will say, in thinking about the example of the millennials who don't make phone calls, this may very well be that for most millennials, they have never actually used their smartphone to make a phone call. They don't realize you can actually punch numbers on it and call people.
Well, I realized in my startup we were going to announce the company, and they wrote the press release, and I said, there's no phone number. And they said, well, we don't have a phone. I said, well, maybe we should have one phone with a number. You know, instead of, we can't put everybody's cell phone on the press release. We have to do something. They were shocked. So,
let me end this part of the event, the discussion, with the following question. So, I think we agree that in a knowledge-based economy, and more importantly, in an innovation-based economy, the most important factor is talent. The question is, how do you win the war of talent? As an organization or as a region, right? We like to compete with Dubai, for example. So how do we make sure we actually attract the best talent to come here and not go somewhere else?
let me tell you a story about Kayak. So we started Kayak, we had this idea, and it was the former head of Orbitz, the former head of Expedia, the former head of Travelocity, and a VC. And we had this idea. And we went out and we found this magnificent CEO and a super CTO. And I watched the CTO. He's the best hiring manager I've ever seen in 40 years in business. He would go anywhere in the world to find the best engineer. And then when he found that engineer, he would always say, who's the smartest person you know? And then he would go find that person. And he spent probably 40% of his time hiring rock stars. And, you know, there's an old saying in Silicon Valley that rock stars hang out with rock stars. It is absolutely true. He built a world-class team, and I watched him interview those people, and they never asked about money, and they never asked about shares. They asked about how are we changing the world and what are we doing. And that's the way you attract world-class people. And you really have to build the seeds of super world-class people. And then other people want to be on that team. I mean, I don't care whether it's the World Cup or whether it's a baseball team, people want to be on winning teams. And they want, if they're superstars, they want to be with other performers, and they don't want to be with slugs. They want to be with other superstars. That, starting that way is I've seen it was totally different than other teams I've worked on, and we went public with only 200 people because they were 200 unbelievable people.
So I was fortunate enough to go to do my undergraduate work at Stanford and to go to business school at Harvard Business School. Classmates should applaud now. I have a number of my classmates who came on this trip, and there's a couple of other alumni in the crowd. What's interesting is we think of these schools as markers of talent. Like these are the kinds of people we want to hire. But I would ask the question, why do people think that students from Stanford are good hires? Well, I would say that it's because people say, well, gee, you know, in the startup world, who founded Yahoo? Stanford students. Who founded Google? Stanford students. And so on and so forth. And the same thing holds true if you think about the companies that you might be trying to hire people from. A lot of times people will say, well, I want to hire someone from Google, or I want to hire someone from Facebook. And part of it is they've done a good job of selecting them. They've hired the rock stars. But part of it is also something else, which is that those institutions, be they colleges and universities, or be they specific organizations and businesses, have demonstrated their ability to produce great talent in the form of the alumni of those organizations. And when you hire the best talent, it's very important to bring them in, to try to hold on to them as long as possible. You want to get as much out of them as you can. But ultimately, I would argue that the way we judge organizations is by what people do, not just at those organizations, but after they leave or after they go on to bigger and better things. So the thing that I always tell people about winning the war for talent is, these days you don't win the war for talent, as Terry has said, by offering more money or more shares, although apparently if you offer enough, it will work. I actually had a company that lost an employee to Snap after Snap offered him $4 million in restricted stock. There's an even more extreme example. There was one employee at Google whom Twitter tried to poach, and Google actually gave this employee a $100 million package to stay. Now, I don't know about you, but if I got $100 million to stay somewhere, I would say, I'm definitely retained, that's not a problem. But that's not realistic. We can't just do that for everyone. But what you can do is you could say, my organization is a launch pad for talent. The people who worked for me are now CEO at this company, VP at that company, managing director at this company. And if you come and work for me or you come and work for our organization, that can be you as well. So in addition to all those other things, think about telling the story about how your organization has helped other people in their career, the people who came before them.
Very good. Thank you so much. So if you don't mind, remain on your seats. I'm going to invite our third guest speaker for the evening, Katherine Glassey. Katherine is a co-founder and executive and advisor of numerous tech companies that I'm not going to mention all of them here, but I will mention Brio Technology. So Katherine was a founder and CEO of a company called Brio Technologies in the 80s and 90s. Brio Technology single-handedly launched the business intelligence wave. I think they were one of the first pioneers into this whole world of business intelligence that later became analytics, and now we know as big data. It's all the same thing. It's all about providing intelligence to businesses to make decisions. If you've ever used pivot tables on Excel, by the way, you have Katherine probably and her team to thank for, because they were the inventor of pivots. I found out one thing in common between Katherine and I just yesterday, which is that I think in the late 90s, I stole away one of your employees from Brio to work for my startup. Now, he was my classmate in college, so I think he made that decision because he felt bad for me, not because he wanted to escape. So come on, Katherine, welcome.
Thank you. You're going to give me your mic?
I will give you my mic.
All right. Thank you. I'm terrible with handheld mics because I wave my hands around, but I will do my very best. That was an amazing introduction. I was actually going to lead by saying I was proud of having run Brio because I met one of the recruiters many years after we'd taken Brio public who said that Brio was the hardest company to steal people from ever. And to my knowledge, I never lost anyone. So who did you get? Oh, yep, he did. Never argue with the man who invites you on stage. Anyway, so thank you all very much for coming here. I am presenting material that is not mine. So I feel like a professor who's lecturing from a book that she didn't write. And we do that all the time. Yeah, but I don't usually do it. I usually do my own stuff. So let me dive right in. I'm presenting the work of a friend of mine, Kim Scott, who worked at both Apple and Google. And what she has done very recently is write a book called Radical Candor. And the purpose of her book is to help teach people how to manage and lead teams by improving their relationships with each other. So I'm going to start by giving you an example of how someone once spoke to me with radical candor in a way that changed the course of my company. This was actually at Brio, and it was about 8 years in to the history of Brio, where we had been struggling and bootstrapping and fighting our way up, and we had actually achieved a massive quarter that was twice the size of the previous year. We'd gotten our first round of venture funding from Kleiner Perkins, and we actually had a sales team that was selling software for the first time. So to celebrate this, we'd taken all of the star performers of the company on a real vacation. We took them to a place with white sand beaches and boats and fizzy drinks with little umbrellas in them that were handed to you when you were on the beach. It was a love fest. Everyone who was there had a ball. And they told each other that they were happy, and they told me that they were happy. And when we came back from that, I was convinced I was the best manager on the planet because I had made all these people happy. That lasted about 20 minutes, because that first Monday when I was back in the office, my head of engineering showed up. His name was Brian. He walked into my office and shut the door. We had doors in those days. Looked angrily at me and said, "Katherine, I hate doing this because you know I love this place, but I can't stand working for you anymore because I don't trust you." The guy still has the suntan from the beach. Literally. And here he is telling me that he hates me and doesn't want to work for me anymore. Fortunately, I was so terrified I didn't say anything, so he kept talking. And the longer he talked, the angrier he got and the more upset he got. And he said he didn't trust me, the entire engineering team didn't trust me anymore. They thought I was on their side, and it turned out I wasn't. And I had no idea what was going on. But eventually it came out. And the truth is, I had screwed up. While we were on vacation, the heads of sales and marketing had come to me and said, "Yo, Katherine, we're now selling to big companies like IBM and Xerox and Procter & Gamble, and I'm going in with a title of manager." Now, the truth is, we all were a scrappy startup, and I'd never given anyone titles. You were either a manager or you were a staff, and we never noted what the titles were. They convinced me that to get credibility with these big companies, they needed a big title. So I made them both VPs. Didn't think anything of it. Well, you know, people talk to each other, right? And somehow on the plane coming back, my head of engineering had heard that the heads of sales and marketing had been promoted, and they were now vice presidents. And that meant I loved sales and marketing more than I loved engineering, more than I loved my product department. I hadn't consulted him. He didn't trust me. He hated me. He couldn't work for someone who didn't value. You get the story. So I felt terrible because he was 100% right. Not that I didn't love engineering, but I had done something thoughtless. I hadn't shared it, hadn't told anyone. So, long story short, we fixed it, of course, and he actually was, in fact, the vice president of engineering when we went public 2 years later. So he didn't quit. But the point of that story is he was able to give me some really tough feedback, telling his boss that I had screwed up, and I was able to hear it and act. I didn't fire him. I promoted him. So why was he able to give me that feedback? And how did it change the course of the company? Now, he could have actually been mad and quit. He didn't have to talk to me, but he chose to take a risk, put his career on the line, and make an effort to make the company better. He did it because he cared personally about the company, and I think he actually kind of liked me, and he chose to challenge me directly. And when he combined those two things, I was able to listen, and he didn't quit, I didn't fire him, and we made the changes to make the company a better place. I didn't know that that's why I was able to hear him at the time. I'm not as smart as my friend Kim. She's the one who says, if you can talk to someone, both personally, by relating to them as a human, you can give them difficult feedback, and it won't hurt your relationship. It will, in fact, make it stronger. It is the place in which you can speak truth. Truth to power, truth to your peers, truth to your employees. And that is what the book Radical Candor is all about. So I'm going to give you, in a few more minutes, just a little bit of an overview of the very first chapter of this book. It is a lovely, easy read, very dense book that I highly recommend to everybody. But let me explain a little bit about what Kim has done. I'm an engineer by training, so I've got to take apart each of the axes so you understand what the quadrants are. So the first axis is the care personally axis. This is, we call the give a darn axis. And this is the axis about how you relate to the other people in your organization. Now, why do I even have to talk about this? They're people, right? Of course you are nice to the people at work. But the truth is, from the very first time that we get a job, we are told to act professional at work. And what this means is, most of us that means we have to leave the human side of us back at home, the best part of us, the part that's open and honest and has fun and cares about other people, because we think that's unprofessional. But that is a terrible, terrible way to behave at work. In fact, at Google, brag moment here, my daughter works at Google. Her first day at Google, they said, bring your whole self to work. That's how they make the culture work at Google. So if you just start at being professional, it is easy to go down this axis. The first step down the axis is just to be apathetic and actually not, notice the people that you're working with, heads down, and just do stuff. But if you go really far down this axis and you end up in the kind of office politics world, you end up in a place where managers kind of treat their staff like inanimate objects, like pawns on a chessboard that you just move around without caring about what happens to them. Or you find peers treat each other as obstacles on the way that they need to step on as they're climbing up the ladder. Or worse, they look at their managers as tyrants who they have to topple, and you get people who are overtly or covertly not supporting the goals of the organization. All that happens because you're not looking at the people you work with as humans. That if you just give a darn about them, you won't behave that way anymore. You won't have those kind of relationships. And in the best case, since you spend so much time at work, maybe you even find that you care for the people at work. Now, we use the word love on this axis. This isn't the love that will destroy marriages, but this is the kind of love that you feel when you're working together for something that you really care about and enjoy doing. So that's the care personally axis. But love is not all we need, unfortunately. So the other axis is the challenge directly axis. This is the, forgive the language, piss people off axis. Unfortunately, we don't get better if we're not told what we do well and where we're lacking. That it's hard to tell someone when they're not doing a good enough job. It's hard to tell someone that they need to improve. We're terrible at this. And the reason it's not actually our fault. We were taught from the time that we first learned to speak by our parents, if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. So we're fighting years and years and years of training in ourselves when we have to go confront someone with something that they didn't do well, particularly when we think it might hurt their feelings. So if you are a manager working in an organization, if you have peers, if you have friends who you care about, it's actually your job to tell people how to improve. It's your job to give them the guidance that will let them know how they can not just be good, not just where they are doing good work, but where they are not doing good work and what they can do to do better. Not just even a job, but it's a moral obligation. This is a calling. If you are entrusted with a job, if you're entrusted with people who work for you, how can you expect them to be better? How can you make the mission of the company successful if you're allowing people, if you're depriving people of the knowledge of how they can do a better job? So when you put these two things together, you get this beautiful 4-quadrant map. And this map guides our interactions, how we deliver feedback in an office environment. So when you both care personally and challenge directly, you are operating in the radical candor quadrant. It's green because we like being there. That's the space when you can actually tell someone, like Brian did to me, I screwed up, I let him down. It's hard to be there. It's easier to be in the quadrant that we call ruinous empathy. That means you like people, you're nice to them, but you don't ever say anything useful or challenging to them. What it actually means is you're being somehow untruthful by leaving out critical information that they might need to hear. But we think it's easier there. We think we go there to make friends. But if your friends never tell you that you're screwing up, if your friends never tell you that you forgot to comb your hair in the morning, they're not actually your friends. You can't trust what they say if they're not being 100% honest with you. So ruinous empathy is not a great place to be, but we make a whole bunch of management mistakes when we stay there. But it's not quite as bad a place to be, or an equally bad place to be is the quadrant we call obnoxious aggression. This is when you just walk up to people and just verbally let them have it. You just kind of walk up with complete disregard. You could think of it as someone who's rude or someone who is just really, really painful to work with all the time. Every once in a while, Everybody is there. You lose your temper. You say something that you actually meant, but you said it in a very ungentle way. Sometimes that's necessary, but at least the feedback gets delivered. As opposed to being in the lower left quadrant, manipulative insincerity. Basically, never telling anyone what you actually think or lying to their face, or not caring enough to even bother. The worst of office behavior happens down here because people are intentionally preying on someone else's weaknesses in order to accomplish their own goals. So those sound pretty terrible, right? But the truth is, we're all there every day in various times. So I'm going to give you a really, really quick overview of an example of how this works in real life. And this actually happened to me one day, so I'm going to turn red even trying to tell the story. I'm a shoe person. I love shoes. And I was getting ready to go to a board meeting, and I couldn't decide whether I was going to wear my favorite black pumps or my white pumps. And I was trying them on in the mirror. I had 2 little kids at the time, and ran out of the door wearing one of each shoe. The ladies are laughing. Guys, you might have worn mismatched socks. That's nothing compared to wearing mismatched shoes. I didn't notice it. I mean, I was running a company, we were big, I had all these little kids around. I didn't even notice, right? I was probably on the phone going to work. Fortunately, so if one of my friends at work had happened to notice me when I walked in wearing one black shoe and one white shoe, it would have to have been a girl, might have said something about, Katherine, I really admire your fashion choice, but did you know that you're wearing one, mismatching shoes? I would have turned beet red, but at least I would have known right when I walked in the door. Now, an obnoxiously aggressive approach to that would have been when I walked in the door, someone said, "Good God, what did you do?" That's not very nice, right? I mean, you can be really rude. Someone could say, that's the worst pair of mismatching shoes I've ever seen. They could have hurt my feelings in the process. The manipulative insincerity might be someone who looks at my shoes and looks at me and says, "Wow, I really like your haircut." Yeah, totally not helpful. The ruinous empathy is almost as bad. These are my friends who I've seen all day long as I'm walking around, and none of them say a thing because none of them want to point out something that they think might embarrass me or hurt my feelings. Now, even these people who are being nice to me by not telling me that I'm making a mistake are still not enabling me to correct or change or be better. So I don't know how to trust them if at the end of the day I discover that there were 5 people who noticed that I was not wearing matching shoes and none of them said a word. How did that help me improve? So obviously that's a kind of a silly example, but you can hopefully imagine how you might apply that kind of a thought in a work environment. So this is the first chapter of Radical Candor, is to introduce the notion that there are these, by combining caring personally about someone with the ability to give feedback, both positive and negative, both critical and supportive, can be done from a position of caring personally about them, sharing something, or from a position of actually not trying to be helpful at all. And when you model this, when an organization functions where people are talking to each other and helping each other improve in the green box of Radical Candor, the organization's dynamics, culture, engagement changes. And you can actually observe this in your own organizations in individual interactions. One of the things that Kim told me, by the way, is that people can practice this at home with your children, with your spouse. Learn to listen and speak differently and see how it works at home. So that's certainly one thing you can try. You can also buy the book or go to the website. But being aware of them is the start, and I'll actually put the websites up on here if you want to go visit radicalcandor.com. Thank you very much.
So I think we have, thank you so much, Katherine, that was wonderful.
You're welcome.
Very good. I think we have maybe 10, 15 minutes for questions. So if you have any question for anybody in the audience, please raise your hand.
Terry has one.
The uncomfortable silence for a little bit.
They want food.
Thank you so much for this amazing discussions. My question to you is about the productivity of teams. We are in a very tough market nowadays. Challenges on business, on cost control, and profit margins make it very hard. I have a company of 34 people, and I struggle every day to make sure that everybody is productive enough. We bring the tools, we bring the systems. People sometimes forget to use, people sometimes. So how can we connect the engagements with the productivity? Is it self thing that it need to be obtained, or what's your says on this?
Is productivity related to engagement? Or is it related to training? They haven't learned how to use these tools yet.
Yes. So, but I'll go a little bit further because I need to actually be helpful in addition to glib. So when you think about the productivity of your teams, the key to the teams is not just the additive talent of the individual employees, it's how they work together. And how they work together is highly dependent on the nature of the relationships that you've been able to build. I think we've heard from both Terry and Katherine about the importance of trust, the importance of being able to speak with radical candor. I think one of the ways of describing this is essentially the culture of the organization. So it's very difficult as a manager to actually always be there, to answer all the questions, to tell people what to do.
And you shouldn't.
And you shouldn't. That's what culture is for. Culture is what allows people to know what to do when you're not there. And in building the culture of teams and teamwork, oftentimes what's really helpful is to be able to find a way for those teams to work together as effectively as possible. In terms of organization, for example, I often like to cite the example of Jeff Bezos and the 2-pizza team. So teams that are small enough such that you can feed them with just 2 pizzas are the teams that are going to be most effective. This is not just because large organizations are bad. They're certainly well managed. It's because when you have a team that is small enough to fit around a single table and eat 2 pizzas, the number of interpersonal relationships to manage is actually relatively small. Double the size of the team, you don't double the relationships, you multiply it by an exponential factor.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, I won't forget that when I ran the computing systems in American Airlines, we added a 5th system, but we only got about 3 or 4% more productivity because it spent all its time talking to the other 4, right? And that's exactly the same thing that happens with teams. So I use 2-pizza teams as well all the time. They have to be small, they have to be empathetic, they have to know each other well, and it has to be safe. And training certainly is there as well. I mean, they have to be trained to use the tools, but if they're engaged and they want to move forward and they can see the goal where they have to get, then the productivity will follow, I think.
I think the safety is a really key word. I find that one of the things that happens with close-knit teams is they actually help each other out. And they make suggestions. They lift someone up if they're having a slow day. They gently remind or directly remind each other if work needs to be done that they're counting on. A team can be a self-correcting organism if it is safe for members of that team to talk to each other.
I would add, that's a great example and a great thought. And an example of that was I had a team of 200 people in France, half Americans and half French. We built the software for the TGV, the French railroad. And we said that we had to make this deadline and that it was one deadline for everyone. And that was very difficult for some people to accept. The systems guys were done early, and they actually had to help the application guys. And programmers were helping marketing people. It had never happened. And the American and French were sharing, everything. It drove them crazy, but it got the work done, and they were a total team. And they actually did help each other in ways they had never thought possible because they had this common goal.
Thank you very much. From your experience when you are recruiting your team, actually, what do you focus in the interview, especially for millennials? I mean, to get and to build the good team, it's all starts with the recruitment. On what do you focus actually?
So in terms of recruiting, there are obvious things, qualifications, degrees, skills, and so on and so forth. But one of the things, which we've been harping on a lot today, is the nature of culture. And if you look at highly successful companies that have scaled up rapidly, oftentimes paradoxically, the reason they've been able to do this is because they took the time to really set their culture. So Google, for example, was started by Larry Page and Sergey Brin. Larry and Sergey interviewed each of the first 400 or 500 employees. So if you were being hired at Google as employee number 499, you had to talk to the two founders before you got your job offer. The same holds true for companies like Airbnb and so on and so forth. Now the difficulty lies in when your company gets to the point where you can't do that anymore. Some of you may run organizations that are so large you couldn't possibly interview everyone that gets hired. I heard sometime today the statistic that 15,000 more people are hired every day in Qatar, which is quite a large number. So what you need to do in that case is to figure out, well, how can I make this culture scalable? And if you look at the example of Airbnb, what they've done is they've actually established certain people as cultural interviewers. They're not focused on figuring out their skills. They're not focused on giving them a programming problem and seeing if they solve it the right way. They're focused on figuring out if this person is going to be compatible with our culture. And compatibility is not just saying that you match the existing culture exactly. That actually can cause a lot of problems. A culture that is completely homogeneous, where everyone has to behave the same way, is not going to be as creative and innovative. Rather, it's a question of, are people going to be additive to the culture? If we add this person to the stew of our culture, will it make the stew tastier?
Yeah, I think it's really important. And I hear that Sergey and Larry still interview people. And
Absolutely.
they
They just don't do all of them.
They'd still jump down, and so the people below them who were interviewing really focus on what they're going to do, because they know that Sergey could show up at any minute and is going to want to know the cultural questions. I mean, look at Southwest Airlines in the United States. They have a culture different than every other airline, and they focus on that culture in hiring, much more than where have you worked, what is your training. You know, they focus on values and how people think and how they treat customers, and you see it every day on the airplanes. I mean, people, they like to be there, they're happy to be there. You fly in other airlines, they tell you about their salary went down and their vacation is bad and their food is garbage, and who wants to hear from those people? Southwest is different. So I think it's core to hiring is to build that culture first and get people who fit with what you want to be.
If I can just chime in, the culture is reinforced by the way the peers treat each other. So your culture is watched from below, but it is modeled every day by the employees themselves. So if you have just a group of two who treat each other with respect and directness, and a third person comes in, those two will treat that person with respect and directness, and they will get that that's how to fit in. So it builds itself in a positive way once you get it started.
And let me add one other thing, which is, there's a company that's in the news a lot recently, Uber. Maybe you've heard of them at some point. So with Uber, one of the things that came out is that there were employees, managers, who were behaving very badly. And the culture of Uber was such that, well, that person's very productive, so we're going to overlook the bad behavior. Well, oftentimes people talk about culture and say, well, culture is our values, culture is what drives our decisions. Well, if culture does not cause you to get rid of people who deliver financially, but don't deliver in terms of your values, then you don't actually have a strong culture.
Yeah, and the hardest thing to do is to fire the jerks who make the numbers. Right? They're making the number, but you can't stand them. And the team will reward you immediately if you fire them. Immediately.
Yes.
Because they know they're there, and they hate them. They want you to fire them, and you're when it's saying, but they make their numbers. No, get rid of them.
That's wild. And then
So does the culture grow over time, and how, because it looks like it may grow over time and until to getting to a steady state maybe or something. How resilient should it or should it not be, and does it change after that?
I think it really does change. I learned something from a guy named Jay Walker, who founded Priceline in the United States. And Jay, for a time, was trying to create other businesses. And he said, there are starters, growers, and runners. And what he was trying to do was build an incubator where, if you started a company and worked there, you could go, when it got into the grower stage, you could go back and start another one. Because there are absolutely people who like to start, and there are people who are better in growing, and then there's a steady state they're called managers, and they manage the company rather than grow the company. I think it's absolutely true. As we grew Travelocity from 6 people to 4,000 people, we had a lot of people early on who left, right? They didn't like the big company anymore. And that very often happens to founders, that founders can't stretch all the way. I was lucky because I'd done a couple startups, and then I worked in American Airlines, and then I went back and forth, so I at least had the training. But many people don't have that. So I think the values don't have to change, but the way the company operates and who can actually operate it best at what stage does change, can change.
Question there?
Okay, thank you very much for the inspiring discussion that you can see on the stage. And my question is for Katherine. I'm here. All right.
For the disembodied voice.
You talked about the care personally and challenge directly axis.
Gold star for you.
So which one you think, which axis should a manager or a leader work on first? To build a good relation first with his team as a leader, and then move to the other axes of directly giving the challenge or the constructive feedback or that stuff.
Can I help with that question a little bit?
Please.
If you start in the bad quadrant, if you are embedded in an organization where, what did you call it? The
manipulative insincerity.
And you need to work on changing the culture. It's a really good question. Do you start moving that direction or that direction first?
Do we have an hour? I think we want to go somewhere else. In summary, that's a tough road to hoe. Kim actually believes that learning to give people direct feedback is better, even if you do it in an uncomfortable way, than being nice but not giving useful direction. Because the top quadrant, the ruinous empathy, means the person that you're talking to can't actually trust what you're saying. And if they don't trust you, then even when you move into radical candor, they won't know that that's what you're saying. But that lower, the jerk quadrant, the obnoxious aggression, at least what you're being told there is the truth. You may not like them, and you don't want to keep people who are always there around, but if you have to start giving feedback directly, even if it's a little tough at first, eventually people will know that's where you're coming from. So it's probably better to learn to be straight than to be nice, but disingenuous.
Very good. There is a...
Thank you for the wonderful program tonight. It's very invigorating and thought-provoking. And I have a question for the panel, but Terry in particular. So we talked earlier about, first of all, I love the Boson Layer. That is fantastic. Was it? Oh, stand up. I love the Boson Layer. That's awesome. But I want to touch on the thing between the older folks like me and the millennials. And that gap has always existed for years in business between the ages, the folks who are older and the folks who are younger. And I have a 16-year-old daughter. And the reality is the way we communicate is seeming, the divergence is seeming to grow. So like if 20 years ago, that same age gap, and you say, how do you communicate? Versus today, 20 years ago, what's the difference? Because what I'm wondering is, if we don't have a little bit of realization of that, radical candor delivered by someone of my age may be viewed as aggression from somebody. So I'd like to hear a little bit of comment about how you think that progression has gone over the course of time.
I wonder if that's true. I mean, I wish there was somebody 110 here who could tell us about what idiots we were, when we were the younger generation. I don't know that it's grown. I think that gap always exists, and I think it always has to be bridged. I mean, I remember even when I was younger at American Airlines, going to the executive committee and the chairman to say we should put power in the seats of the airplanes to power laptops. And they thought I was a complete idiot because they still had secretaries writing memos, and it came in paper, and no one, I was in IT, so I used email, and they didn't know what email was. They thought, no one needs that. Why would we need power in the seats? Costs money, go away. I think that's, the younger generation have been idiots since the beginning of time. And I think we have to deal with that. But I think we have to listen. Look, I live in a small town in Nevada, and my insurance agent is, the typical good guy in town. He's in the Rotary Club, and he's in the parade, and he's sold insurance forever. And he said one day, we were talking, and he said, I really don't understand social media, and I don't understand YouTube, and I don't know what to do. And a couple of weeks later, I said, well, you've been thinking about it. What did you do? And he said, I hired my kids. And his kids are doing all that for him. And he said, I didn't know how to do it. I simply knew I had to do it. And I think that's the realization that I try to lecture when I'm lecturing to corporations is you don't have to know how to do it. You just need to know that you must do it. And hire the people who can do it, who live in that world, who are different than you. And if you don't do that, then your company, particularly today, will be simply passed by. So I don't think it's new problem.
Let me relate an incident that happened that was an experience I had in managing millennials. And it's an incident that might not happen in Qatar, and you'll understand why when I explain. Obviously, I got onto Facebook along with my employees. They began to friend me. And I still remember the first time I saw a status update that said, gosh, I am so hungover today. I hope my manager doesn't ask me to do too much. And for someone like me who came up in an earlier era, this was pretty much unthinkable. And I had to figure out what to do about it. And ultimately I decided the most important thing was to tell that particular employee to go home and sleep because I didn't want them making any terrible mistakes while they're at work that day. But I had to reflect on myself and say, okay, what should I do about this? Should I punish this person? Well, if the person had not posted to Facebook, would I have punished them? No. So what did Facebook do? It gave me greater knowledge of how to manage my employee. So I decided in that instance, all I would do was just say, maybe you should not party quite so hard during the week. The weekend is yours. You do what you want. But ultimately try to learn from it and say, okay, you know what? People are approaching the world in a different way than they approached it in my era. And while I might prefer things to continue to work the way they did when I was growing up, things change. And I have to adapt just like they have to adapt.
Back there.
Hi, my name is Bilal, and I want to start off by thanking the panel for such excellent insights this evening. As an aspiring entrepreneur, there's some wonderful things that we have heard this evening about how to build company culture, and these are the sort of values that we should instill in the employees. I want to flip that situation around and sort of understand what do you think are the biggest challenges or obstacles that stop companies from building a culture like this? And the reason I'm asking this question is because we have a ton of research on the kind of culture that Google has built, and we've been realizing this for the last 10 years that this is such an excellent company to work for. So why don't we have more of those coming even when we know what is required to build an excellent culture?
Everybody reads the same books, so why can't we do it? Why is it so hard?
There are lots of cookbooks. There are not a lot of Michelin chefs, right? Cookbook doesn't make you a Michelin chef. It's hard. It's hard to do, and it also takes an awful lot of work. And you don't think of it as work. It's not, I'm not doing my job. I'm not doing work to do this, but actually you are. So, for a company, I mean, look, you know, Sergey Brin and those guys, I mean, they're super nerds, right? I mean, they're incredible nerds, but they managed to decide this was important for their company. And I think there are companies that don't, that are successful. They can have destructive cultures and they still can succeed sometimes because they have such unbelievable products, but it's rare. So I think it's something you have to spend a lot of time on, and not every company bothers.
It is hard, and it's foreign to move. We all start companies as individual contributors doing something. We start as programmers, we're writing marketing, we're out doing sales, we're doing stuff. The transition to being a manager all of a sudden means that you have to add to the work that you're already doing the responsibility to help the people who are now working for you to do their jobs as well. And it's hard to know how to balance how much time to spend giving people feedback, coaching them, guiding them, with getting all of your own stuff done, doing your emails, and sometimes going home and, you know, feeding the kids. So it is a foreign experience. But what I think the whole notion of radical candor and understanding that just by talking to people quickly, directly, clearly, in 2-minute bits of feedback, you can, with almost no time at all, invest in giving the people who work with you the information they need about how they are doing, both praising and making suggestions. So it's hard, but the more you do it, the easier it gets, and it doesn't have to consume your entire life.
How many of you have a STEM background? That is to say, science, technology, engineering, and math. Most folks. And
Nerd city.
which is wonderful, right? I go to Stanford, which our motto for their football team is Nerd Nation. They have these glasses that they wear. All right, so for those of you who are in science and engineering, how many of you are familiar with the concept of technical debt? All right, good. So I'll just quickly explain. The concept of technical debt basically says that when you are building your application, your software, or what have you, you can't just keep layering on feature after feature after feature, because as you do that, complexity creeps in. Eventually, you have to go back and refactor and actually pay the piper in terms of investing in your tooling and infrastructure. So people often on the technology side understand the need to pay technical debt. But we also experience organizational debt, especially when a company is a startup that's growing very rapidly. And when things are happening, when sales are rolling in, when you have to grow, when there's clients pounding down the door, sometimes you deliberately incur organizational debt. You ignore the problems because there just isn't time. But sooner or later, that debt comes due and you have to pay it. So whether it's technical debt or organizational debt, you have to, in your mind, set the expectation that at some point in time, you're going to have to deal with it. And the key is to figure out when you can actually afford to do it and when you can't afford to do it, because of the fact that things are moving so quickly, you just can't stop and take a pause.
Majid?
Thank you. Hello, good evening. So we keep talking about hiring people in-house. And most of the startups in the Middle East, because we don't have like much access to investors and angels, so we hire people outsourced. Like we do a lot of contract with people in India or in Arab countries. So can we do the same treatment? Like, I mean, can we apply the same treatment with people we hire in-house, with people we hire outsourced, like outside the country? And how can we manage the outsourced people? Like, how can we give them the right load and right responsibilities so they can take our work and like, you know, heavily responsible for that?
So you picked 3 programmers or ELANs. How do you engage them?
Yeah. Well, okay, the 3 programmers from ELANS are easier than an entire remote team a continent away. And my flippant answer to how to manage that team a continent away is lots of air travel. Because there is no substitute for that face-to-face interaction when you get to know at least the manager of that team personally. So when you're talking to them over Skype and Google Hangouts and finding out what's happening and what's going, you know that you have something in common that you can share. personally, I don't know anyone who's got remote teams that doesn't visit them at least once a quarter and spend enough time that they know who they're talking to on the other end. So I don't know if you guys know any way to do it without that.
I don't. I mean, you have to do that, or you have to have somebody from your team who just goes there and lives there and starts it and stays there. Because if it's just, I mean, the only time I see that work is if, you know, somebody's rewriting old code or it's disconnected, that's fine. But in a startup environment, you have to stay connected or you become disconnected to a bad end.
I think it's difficult with outsourced teams simply because there are certain things that it's difficult to give them. Ownership, for example, equity. These are things that typically aren't given to outsourced teams. But despite that fact, I still think it's important to try to manage them, to try to figure out, you know, how it is that the work they do for you is going to actually improve their situation, improve their career, improve what they're trying to do. We often treat outsourced development as if it were a black box. Put in this money, dump this specification over, and it'll just come out the other end. And that doesn't work with an in-house team, and it doesn't work with an external team either. Ultimately, what you have to do is you have to have a team that takes pride in their work, that feels that there's something important about what they're doing, whether or not they're officially on your payroll. And it does pay dividends to take the time to develop that kind of relationship with them, even if they're an outsourced provider.
We take one more question.
Thanks. Thank you very much for tonight's insights. I just want to go back to the team leader and team members feedback situation. Most of the time, a 2-minute, or at least from what I've experienced, a 2-minute conversation wouldn't be enough to convince a team member, a young team member precisely, to take the point and take the feedback and go home and sleep on it and wake up the following day and come to work, you know, with an energized spirit. And I'm talking specifically about young team members because they do have a point most of the time during a conversation. And I don't want to say they're idiots most of the time because we've seen that, you know, these guys are founders of Facebook, Airbnb, Snapchat, and what have you. So the thing is, sometimes they buy it, sometimes they don't, the feedback. Some would take 5 minutes, some would take 10 minutes, some would take, you know, even weeks to get the point and taken. So if I can get any help on that, would be great.
Why don't they listen to his feedback?
Why don't they listen the first time?
Yeah.
Well, I can't actually answer that question off the top.
Are you married?
I'd be happy to talk to you over a bite, and we can look at that as a specific situation. But it might be that it takes 2 minutes a day and a balance mix of pointing out in 2 minutes when you see that employee do something that you liked, say that sincerely and directly at the time. And then if there's something that you see that's small that you don't like, you can give 2 minutes worth of, that didn't work quite as well as I thought you wanted it to. Or, I mean, it's not one conversation for 2 minutes and the world has changed the other end. It might take months to change a culture, to change behaviors patterns. But it doesn't have to be an hour a day with every one of your 10 direct reports. That was what I was trying to say.
You remind me of that phrase, catch them doing something right, because we always try to catch them doing something wrong. So catching them doing something right is a great way to help change behavior. But you know, when I worked at American Airlines, it was a big formal feedback system, and you'd get reviewed, I think, twice a year. It's ridiculous. I mean, your behavior is set. You have to give that constant feedback, and particularly with millennials, even more important. It has to be frequent. And it's hard to train yourself to do that because, again, we're all busy doing work, and you know, this isn't work, it's something else. No, it's not. It is work. It's what part of management is. You have to do it all the time. And with some people, it takes a long time to change behavior. We know that.
I'll say 3 different things. The first is something that I heard from Patty McCord, who used to run human resources for Netflix. And what she said was, one of the things managers have to learn is they're not a load balancer, They're a people manager. And oftentimes we feel like the most important thing is to allocate our resources and figure out who's doing what. And that's important. But even more important is figuring out how do I get the most out of people. And it may be different from person to person. One of the things that helps in terms of giving feedback, and this comes from the book that my co-authors and I wrote called The Alliance, is that if you define what the employee is trying to accomplish and what they're getting out of things, what we call their tour of duty, if they know what their mission is, they know what constitutes success, they know how it helps the company, and they know how it helps them, then your feedback is anchored in something they care about, i.e., how their career is going to progress and how they are achieving their objectives. The final thing is something I stole from Netflix founder and CEO Reed Hastings. And what he said is that one of the things they ask people to do in terms of feedback is to phrase it as either start, stop, or continue. In other words, I want you to start doing something, I want you to stop doing something, or I want you to continue doing something. And what this does is it takes feedback out of the realm of emotion and puts it into the realm of action. And it's highly actionable, and oftentimes, even if it only takes 2 minutes to say, I want you to start doing that because, or I want you to stop doing that because, they have something they can actually take away and come back the next day and begin putting into implementation.
And if I can just add the capstone on that, when you're dealing with an employee as a manager, the way you start with radical candor is you ask your staff to give you feedback. So you approach and say, what could I start doing that would help you be more productive here? What could I stop doing that's getting in your way? Or what would you like me to do more of that's helping you do your job? So invite their criticism. Don't argue, don't listen, just say, or listen but don't argue and say thank you. And that might be a good way to start.